Hello and welcome to Old Lang Schmooze, the Edinburgh Jewish Culture Centre podcast. I'm David, and this is the third of three special podcasts featuring highlights from our Writers Live Writing Lives event. The writers Eleanor Tom, Sarah Sheridan and Rodge Glass joined us to talk about their latest books. Rodge is currently working on his own autobiographical memoir, Joshua in the Sky. The book tells the story of one man's attempt to come to make sense of the death of his nephew from a rare blood condition both share. And we'll be hearing more about Joshua in the Sky when it's published later this year. Meanwhile, in this podcast, Rodge talks about working with and writing about Alasdair Gray, the author of the novel Poor Things, on which the award-winning film of the same name was based. Rodge's biography of Alasdair won a Somerset Maugham Award for non-fiction. So let's talk a bit about Alasdair Gray. How did you manage to persuade Alasdair to let you write his
biography?
Yeah.
Once upon a time, in 2001, I was working in Curlers, which is one of the oldest pubs in Glasgow, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And Alasdair used to come in for a sneaky G&T of a lunchtime. Sometimes he'd come in an hour after his wife, who was doing exactly the same thing, or an hour before. And when I first moved to Scotland in 1997, and it literally happened to me. The first friend I made said, well, if you're going to live in Scotland, you should learn about Scottish literature, read this book. And so from right from the beginning, Lanark was presented to me as a way in which I would kind of prove that I was engaging seriously with Scottish literature. Of course, none of which you got in England. I knew nothing. And very, very quickly became a huge fan of Alasdair's work and very interested in a lot of contemporary Scottish writers. I mean, I was basically starting again, having run away from the community that I grew up in, so I was looking for something to love. But I absolutely fell for Alasdair's work. He came in the pub, I made a fool of myself. He came in the following day. Thankfully, he was so drunk the first day that he'd forgotten me by the second day, so I got to start again. This is the very first chapter of my book. And I did a lot better, having made some mistakes the first time around. And then, lo and behold, at the time that I decided to do the master's course that was then joint between Glasgow and Strathclyde University in writing, Alasdair became a third of a professor. This was, for the staff, an absolute nightmare, and Alasdair himself was incredibly poorly suited to working in a university environment. That said, it was massively exciting to those of us on the course. There was Alasdair, James Kelman, Tom Leonard with the 3/3 of a professor, Janice Galloway gave sessions, Liz Lockhead was in and out, Zoe Wickham, the first black professor at Strathclyde, who was an extraordinary South African novelist who invented creative writing at Strathclyde, Margaret Elphinstone, historical novelist who was at Canongate. All of these people around that course. So you felt like you were absolutely at the centre of Scottish literature immediately.
Amazing.
And you got given this wee form, again, I cover this in the biography, but you got given this wee form that said your top 3 choices for tutors. And I put number 1, Alasdair Gray, please. Number 2, Alasdair Gray, please. Number 3, please, I don't want to work with anybody else. Can you please pair me up with Alasdair Gray? And they did. And some people found him a terrible tutor. He would Tipp-Ex over your own words and then write in his own words in his own handwriting. Then a better idea would occur to him and he'd do it again. It was like a map if you looked at the paper side on. And it became his work. And that was notes on what became my first novel, No Fireworks, which is set in the Manchester Jewish community and came out in 2005. So he was absolutely no use there, but it was so inspiring to be around. He was a brilliant moral compass. He was genuinely humble. One thing I hate is writers that are self-important and act like they're better than other people. And there were some of those people that acted like that, and I was not interested. What attracted me to Alasdair was his genuine humility. And so seeing him close up at work, even before I started working for him as a secretary, that was my education. Moral education, writer's education. He was like a grandfather, and it was wonderful. But I'm also a rank opportunist. And Alasdair would have loads of these assistants over decades because he never learned to use a typewriter. Edinburgh, what's it like? He never learned to use a typewriter, and he used to say, I always assumed a computer was a more complicated version of a typewriter. Which I suppose it is. So he would pace up and down speaking off by heart. And he used to drive his assistants mad. So he would tend to support people for a couple of years who would really get a lot out of it and then move their own writing or visual artistic careers along and then move on and do something else. And at this point, he'd run out of people prepared to work with him, and his wife, Morag, had refused to work with him anymore. So he was looking for somebody, and I just put my hand up. I worked with him for 3 or 4 years on multiple books. It was the most amazing, transformative experience of my life. And I felt really strongly at that point that although Alasdair was a kind of little-known cult writer to many people, that people, particularly in Scotland, I felt in 100 years, people will want to know what it was like to be in a room with him. Now, I never thought that I had any special relationship with him, and I always make a point of saying that. He was way more important to me than I was to him. But I had this access, and nobody had bothered to write about it yet, outside of journalistic pieces. And so I asked him if I would write his biography, and he literally jumped around the room saying, "Be my Boswell." And the whiskey was going everywhere. And then shortly afterwards he would have thought, "Oh shit, what have I just agreed to?" But that was where the idea of mixing up this kind of conventional biographical thing with the personal diaries came from. And then it seemed natural that as a secretary, as anybody in a room with Alasdair Gray, he takes up all of the oxygen. There's no space for anyone. As you can see, I'm quite an extrovert character, but I was kind of quiet in that context, and so it made sense for me to write in a way where I was at the margins or as silent, or occasionally I'd cut in for a line, but basically it was all him.
And he never wrote anything down by hand?
He sometimes wrote by hand, but in order to do all of his manuscripts and the books that he was working on, he would need to deliver them on a computer. And so he would speak off the top of his head, and he would literally be hovering at your shoulder, shaking with a pointing finger, saying like, "Move that word forward," and then there's this long gap. No, actually move it back again. and so you saw in this real-time mechanical way how he put a sentence together, which showed me what patience that takes. I don't have much patience naturally. I had to develop it from seeing how he did it. That was amazing. He had absolutely no clue as to how it worked. I set up his first email account. You had to explain to him what he had, what he didn't need to reply to, and he would act as if you were basically in the 19th century. But all of the things that he was saying and the things that he was writing all seemed to have this coherent moral approach that I felt like that was a guide for me as much as anything else.
And today in theatre we talk about a triple threat or a double threat. He was a triple threat. He was a playwright, a novelist, but also a great artist.
Brilliant visual artist. But at the time that I worked for him, he had no reputation as a visual artist at all. Most of his murals had been erased, covered over, disappeared, literally knocked down. He did a brilliant one in Cross Hill Synagogue on the south side of Glasgow, which was painted over. That was the rabbis at Cross Hill Synagogue were the first people to pay him for visual artwork.
Really?
Yeah, and he'd already done several major murals that took him years. Yeah, but this had to be a cloudscape only because, as many of you might know, in Jewish tradition, you don't represent figures. So he just had to do the clouds, and he developed that style of doing the cloudscapes that was then repurposed in a way for the Oran Moore Auditorium, which is now the biggest free-to-access artwork in Scotland. So he was constantly working on visual art, and all of his literature contained visual art, but at that time, his literary reputation was going like that, and his visual art reputation was like seen as this sort of small downstairs toilet in the house of his reputation, that people saw as this kind of oddly separate thing, but also this really small thing. When I was writing this biography, which is now a historical document, it's so old, I couldn't get anybody that wasn't already a friend of Alasdair's and already thought his writing was great to tell me the art was good or to explain why. That has massively changed now. But all the time I was working with him in one room, he would have visual artist assistants working in another room. Right. They were often young English fellas like me, who couldn't quite believe their luck, and also could only put up with him for so many hours at a time. So he would be moving between the two.
Because he was quite an eccentric character in some ways, wasn't he?
I think if he was born now, we would understand him in a completely different way. He would be diagnosed early. We would be talking about him as neurodiverse, as having extremely high-level abilities within a narrow field. He could recite entire works of 19th century literature off by heart, and yet he found a genuine struggle in operating in practical ways in our society. Now, Alasdair would drink cold soup from the can rather than risk putting it in a pot and heating it up on the hob. So, but what I saw was, from years of following him around, and after I started writing the biography, I would tour around with him wherever he went, and this was good humility training because it forced me as a young writer to realise that I was nothing, rather than going, oh, I've published a novel, so therefore things I say must be important. I was forced to watch how other people saw him, and they looked up at him and down at him at the same time. And they were laughing with him and at him at the same time as well. And I don't think that would happen now. There was a tiny exhibition in 2008 in London where Alasdair was on with a young female artist. And the whole thing was like jokingly, cruelly referred to as Beauty and the Beast exhibitions. You just wouldn't get that now. But people laughed at him whilst also saying that he was a genius. And that made him really challenging to portray, but really fascinating too. But yeah, I mean, he would have described himself as eccentric and was super aware of some of those eccentricities. But it also came from a place that was just all sorts of practical things about the world were genuinely challenging for him. And for my biography, I spoke to his sister, Maura, who's really lovely, a little bit more conformist, to use the Sheridan term, a runner, perfectly happy in the world, you know, to kind of look at Alasdair as a child and be a bit confused as to why he was so anguished and suffering. But she had a really interesting perspective on the way that he behaved, and she felt like a lot of it was a reaction to the way that people responded to him because he was so different to most others. And so he played up certain elements of his personality. He would slip into different accents very knowingly when he would know people were laughing at him, and he would try and harness that energy and use it in a room. I just found all of that kind of thing totally fascinating. Just the absolute blind luck of finding myself in a situation where I could be educated by him, learn from him, and also see the way that others saw him. It's just amazing, amazing.
I believe when you were writing his biography, he said he wasn't going to look at a word of it until you finished.
Yes.
And then he wrote a review of it in The Guardian.
Yes. They published 2 reviews next to each other.
Yeah.
It was so typically Alasdair. Like, ta-da! I'm reviewing you. 2 one conventional review on the right of the page, massive picture of Alasdair in the middle, and a review of his on the left of the page. Yeah, but somebody should study that and write about it in a serious, interrogative way, because it's performance, it's deflection in places. Some of it is genuinely loving, and some of it was not targeted at me or at Guardian readers. It was targeted at his own family.
Right.
Beginning of a longer conversation. Which I'm very happy to have.
So was he happy with your biography?
Well, first of all, it's not his job to be happy, and it's not my job to please him. I was genuinely supportive and loving, and unashamed about that love. You can see it immediately. But I was also questioning about certain things and critical of other things, and that distance was really important. He didn't want me to appear to be sycophantic or to have done a hagiography, and I had no interest in doing one. So in a way, I was kind of pleased that there were things that bothered him. But they were really very small things. He said in that review, I believe that Roger and I will remain friends. And we did, until the day he died. And he could have cut me off, and he didn't.
Alasdair Gray, a secretary's biography, is published by Bloomsbury. Joshua in the Sky by Rodge Glass will be published later this year by Taproot Press. Our Writers Live Writing Lives event was made possible with funding from Scottish Book Trust's Live Literature Fund and the Netherley and Clarkson Charitable Trust. You have been listening to the Edinburgh Jewish Culture Centre podcast. The podcast was produced and presented by David Ian Neville with original music by Phil Alexander. If you want to sign up to the Culture Centre's newsletter and keep up with events online and live, go to our website at www.jcc.scot.